Hi, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. It's great to sort of vaguely see you out in the distance. I want to welcome you to the Harvard Law School Library Faculty Book Talk series. We have a great lineup of authors this fall, and we're super excited to share the work of our faculty with you. Before we get started, I just want to share a few housekeeping items. We are recording this talk, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel next week. And I hope you'll check out our Scholarship at Law blog for more information about how to find that link and upcoming talks. I also thank Dean Manning for his support of our Faculty Book Talk series. And a really big thank you to our team, June Casey, Rachel Parker, Maya Bergamasco, and Teresa Knapp for helping to put this together in this new remote space. We welcome your questions for our author and invite you to use the Q&A feature throughout the talk. We've reserved some time at the end of the presentation for our author, Cass Sunstein, to engage with your questions. I also encourage you to visit your local bookseller to purchase today's book, or visit the Harvard Library and you can borrow the book in e-format. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Cass R. Sunstein, the Robert Walmsley University professor here at Harvard. He's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at the law school. In 2018, he received the Holmberg Prize from the government of Norway, sometimes described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and Humanities. In 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And after that, he served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technology and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. Mr. Sunstein has testified before congressional committees on many subjects, and he's advised officials at the UN, the European Commission, the World Bank, and many nations on issues of law and public policy. He serves as an advisor to the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. Professor Sunstein joins us today to discuss his most recent book, Too Much Information: Understanding What You Don't Want to Know. Personally, as an information professional, the problem of too much information and how to sift through the vast amounts of information available to me, and finally, how to determine what is useful or valuable are questions I regularly ask myself. Professor Sunstein's book provides insight into our information-seeking or retreating behavior and seeks to define the boundaries of when and what is too much information. Professor Sunstein, thank you so much for joining us, and I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, and thanks everybody. It's a thrill to be able to talk to you in this way, and this book cuts close to my personal bone, I confess, and you'll see why, which makes me especially delighted to be able to talk to you about it. Okay, I'm going to give you some tales, some of which involve numbers, to give a kind of précis of what the topic is and what the concerns are. So recently I asked a group that's a lot like America in terms of demographic diversity and a lot of people. Would you like to know whether the person on whom you have a crush has a crush back on you? And the answer was 58% said yes, which though was an English major, I know that means 42% said no. So kind of a 50-50 split, which was mildly surprising. So I asked, I thought people would want to know if the person on whom they had a crush back. So I asked a very large Harvard class what they thought, Harvard Law School class, and 99% plus said they want to know. Basically, almost every, it was one person who didn't want to know. Okay, that's a puzzle. Why does roughly America get a 50-50-ish split? And why are Harvard Law students 100% I want to know? Okay, that's some numbers. You're going to hear some more. When I was in the US government, I was keen on information disclosure as a regulatory and legal approach to helping inform people's choices. And we had an active debate in the White House about our calorie label rule and whether it should apply only to chain restaurants like McDonald's and Burger King, or whether it should apply also to movie theaters. And I thought, given the health problem that the calorie labels were attempting to respond to apply the rule to movie theaters was a good idea. And as the deliberations continued, we proposed not to include movie theaters, but when we finalized the rule in response to public comments, which had some data in them about the health risks, we did indeed decide to include movie theaters. So I sent a note to a very good friend celebrating this decision, and her answer to me had 3 words: Cass ruined popcorn. That was deflating, but it was also, I thought, profound, because what she was doing was drawing attention to the fact that when people go to the movie theater to see Tenet, movie I recently saw and highly recommend, they don't want to be having a negative relationship to their food. They want to be having a fun night out. Now, the concern about ruining popcorn isn't a decisive objection to information provision or calorie labels, but if we're thinking about the consequences of information provision on human lives, it's something that matters. Okay, here's my next tale. It goes back decades. My dad, when he was in his 60s, a relatively young man, was a very active tennis player, but he started stumbling on the tennis court. This was uncharacteristic. My mother and I brought him to the hospital, the Mass General Hospital, for tests, and he had a battery of tests in the course of a very lengthy morning. And my mother came back in the afternoon, where we were having a late lunch, and said to my dad and me, "I have fabulous news. The results are in. And you," he said to my dad, "are completely fine. There's no serious problem here. They're going to keep you overnight for some further kind of precautionary tests, but you're basically fine. You dodged a bullet. Let's celebrate." And we had a very happy lunch there in the hospital, all of us. When the meal was over, my mother brought me to the car where she was going to drive me back to Harvard Law School. I was a student at the law school at the time. And she was a little like, maybe a lot like, an actor whose emotions were able to switch instantaneously. Though this wasn't acting, her emotions switched to a face expression I'd never seen on a human being's face before or since, which was of despair. And she said, "He's going to die. He's going to die within a year. There's no hope. This is a completely futile situation. He has a brain tumor, it's quite advanced. There's nothing they can do. But I'm not going to tell him, and you're not going to tell him either." Okay, that was a life-defining moment, and it involved something more dramatic than the line, "Cass ruined popcorn," but in the same universe. The thought was that she wanted her husband to have a good final year and not a tombstone of a final year. And I think she also wanted herself to have a good, however much time there was, even though she saw the tombstone. At least she could live a life of a degree of normality, she was thinking, with her husband for as long as his health held up. Now, the book is agnostic on whether she made the right call. Every family would make a different call, I think, in this circumstances. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. But I actually believe she made the right call, given her husband and herself. Motivated by this story, which emerged from the recesses of my mind while I was in government, and by my experience in government, I've embarked on a 4-year research project on the topic of information seeking and information avoidance and its implications for law and public policy. And I'm going to tell you 3 pieces of it and then invite questions. So the first part is that governments need to do a much better job in thinking about ruining popcorn, and thinking about the human consequences of providing information. And this is true not just of governments, it's true of people who run libraries, doctors, nurses, banks, lawyers, people in all walks of life need to think much more systematically about what are the actual consequences of providing information. I'll give you one little example as a flavor of regulation and law. There's a new law in place which requires disclosure of genetically modified organisms in food. The Trump administration finalized its rule, and it's clear from the Trump administration's analysis of its rule, and I'm here to tell you the Obama administration's analysis would be very similar, that the government doesn't believe that the rule is going to help human health at all. No evidence of that. Nor does it believe that the rule is going to have environmental benefits. No evidence of that. So the government's claim is, in terms of health and environmental benefits, we got nothing. We do have costs. This is going to be an expensive rule, not crazy expensive, but expensive. The labels are going to cost something. So we're getting costs on consumers and no benefits. It's actually a little worse than that, because there's data suggesting that some people will see the labels and respond, oh my gosh, danger, which suggests that the human consequences of this information disclosure may on net be more money, not more health, not more environmental protection, but more fear and avoidance of a product which doesn't cause health harms. Okay, that's a little preview. So to think hard about the human consequences. The second has to do with acquisition of information by government. When I was in government, I oversaw the Paperwork Reduction Act, which isn't a mischievous or fiendish name. It actually is sincere, Paperwork Reduction Act. But notwithstanding that law, when I left the government, we imposed something like 9 billion annual hours in paperwork burdens on the American public. I'm not proud of that. The number now is over 11 billion hours. And those hours, let's call them sludge, consisting of paperwork burdens, are part of a universe of frictions that people face when they attempt to navigate life. There may be sludge that comes from Harvard. It might be sludge that comes from Massachusetts. It might be sludge that comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. It might be sludge that comes from the Department of Homeland Security. And what's being acquired with that 11 billion hours, which is just a window, is off onto the sludge problem, which is much bigger than that 11 billion. What's being acquired is often very important and even essential, but often it really isn't. And it's imposing not only a time tax on people who can't afford it frequently, but it's also like a barrier or a wall that separates people from something that could make their lives better. That's too much information. And then third, I'm going to tell you something about social media. So we're going to start with too much information as it's provided by, especially by government mandates, then talk about sludge, then talk about social media. Okay, intrigued by the ruined popcorn claim, I've done now a series of surveys. I have data from 11 countries about what the world thinks, what information the world wants, what information the world doesn't want, and what information the world is willing to pay for, and what information the world is willing to pay not to get. So some people are willing to say, I don't want to hear that, and I'll pay you real money if you'll shut up and not tell me. Okay, here's some data. You know, about 58% of people in a pretty large sample in America want to know whether the person on whom they have a crush on them. I'm watching, by the way, the old TV show, The Wonder Years, where everyone in the show seems to want to know whether the person on whom they have a crush has a crush on them. They're more like Harvard law students than like America. 43% of Americans want to know the calories in their meals for the next year. 57% don't. A minority don't want their popcorn to be ruined. 27% of people want to know the year of their death, And that's approximately the number we're getting across the world in 11 countries. Strong majority doesn't want to know the year of their death. 47% of people want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's. 58% want to know if they show a tendency to cancer. Only 42% want to know what their friends and family really think of them. Pause over that one, would you? Why? Why don't people want to know what their friends and family really think of them? 42%, a minority, want to know how much warmer the planet will be in 2100. Only 57% of people want to know if their partner or spouse cheats. 53% want to know if there's a heaven, a bare majority. Only 44% want to know if there's a hell. So some people who want to know if there's a heaven don't want to know if there's a hell. With respect to questions of relevance to law and policy, 67% want to know the safety ratings for their tires. 65% want to know side effects of pain relievers. And basically, for the kinds of disclosures that the legal system is often interested in providing, we typically get a majority of people interested, but it's not an overwhelming majority. Okay, I confess that once I acquired this data after about 9 months of, kind of not testing a hypothesis, just finding out things, I felt baffled about what I had. And while I published it as a working paper, I didn't have an account. It was just like random data. Here's an effort to provide an account with the help of a neuroscientist named Tali Sharot at the University of London. There are 3 things going on here that help explain the data I've just told you about. The first is people care a lot about whether information is useful. That's not a shocking discovery, but it has more implications than its obviousness suggests. So some information is useful in the sense that you can save money or improve your health if you get it. Some information is useless in the sense that you already know it, or if you knew it, you wouldn't care or change your behavior. And some information is actually affirmatively harmful to you in the sense that you'll live your life worse if you get it. Okay, some people are thinking, I'm sure, that I want to know if I have a predisposition to Alzheimer's or if I'm going to get Alzheimer's, because then I'll live my life differently. And that will help me and my family cope better. So please do tell me. Some people, by contrast, are thinking, I don't want to know that because it's just going to make me sad and it's not going to affect my behavior at all. Some people want to know the calorie labels because they think that will help me avoid health risks, diabetes, obesity, etc. Please tell me. Others say, I don't have a health risk. I'm fine. This is not information I'm willing to pay anything for. I don't want it. Others think I'm overweight. I don't love it, but that's how I am. And the calorie label isn't going to affect me at all. I'm still going for and now I'm going to speak autobiographically, I'm still going for the chocolate croissant. Even if I see the calorie label, it's going to have no impact on me. Lawyers might not want to know whether their client is guilty. And people who are hiring for an entity in a large pool of applicants might be alert to their propensity to discriminate or the propensity of their employees to discriminate. So they might think, I don't want to know anything about the race or gender of applicants. That's too much information. It will lead me, despite my better self potentially, to take into account something that I don't want to be taking into account. There's work on implicit attitudes, which suggests that even people who deplore discrimination are or may be in some sense discriminators, and that suggests the too much information problem is real in some of these contexts. Okay, so that's usefulness. The second point, which my mother in the story of my dad and my friend in the story of calorie labels are onto, which is the emotional impact of information. And here I want to make a plea for attending more intensely to this element of information provision than we typically do. And by we, I mean anyone who's in a position to provide or to compel the provision of information. This isn't the only factor by any means, but it's not nothing. If people think this information is going to make me scared or sad, then that is a loss to their life. And it's also a clue that information provision is less likely to be effective than it would be otherwise. If you terrify people with information, it might be that not only isn't it going to ruin their day or potentially year, it might be make it harder for them to take the steps that are necessary for them to eliminate the source of terror. And yes, I'm thinking of the pandemic, where an information campaign that only makes people really scared without also making people feel that they have agency and hope is likely to be doubly imperfect. First, it creates a bad period for the emotions of those who hear the information. And second, it might make it less likely that they will do what they could do to improve the situation. Okay, now if we put these two things together, the instrumental value and the emotional impact, we can start testing some hypotheses in the fullness of time, which means kind of now, and also understanding what probably lies behind the unruly data I described to you, where it's the case that some people think, you know, this information about my health risks, that's really useful. And even though it's going to make me sad, I want to know. And others are thinking it's pretty useful, I admit that, but I don't want to be made sad or scared, so please don't tell me. Other people are thinking with respect to, say, disclosures of safety, features of things you buy, that's useful and I can certainly handle it. Others are thinking that's not very useful and I don't want to have to think about that. And that provides a gold mine of material for how to think of stuff of relevance to policy and health generally. So let me tell you a little bit about those in sequence, and policies kind of my, law and policy is what I do. Health is not my expertise, so I'm going to be a little reckless on the second. With respect to policy, some of you may know that regulators are required by executive orders that have persisted under Democratic and Republican presidents, and this is sometimes relevant to court proceedings also, must assess costs and benefits. Okay, whether you love cost-benefit analysis or not, let's just stipulate that it's a coin of the realm. The government agencies have often been stymied in thinking about how to analyze the costs and benefits of graphic warnings for cigarettes, calorie labels, things involving information about sunscreen and whether it's going to help you avoid skin cancer, nutrition labels, fat labels, meaning this contains X% fat, et cetera, mortgages, credit cards, etc., and much more. I think what we have to notice is that if we focus on the instrumental value and the emotional value, we will have a road in to thinking about the benefits of information disclosure. And the latest data we have with respect to calorie labels actually gives us unprecedented clarity with respect to their impact. The kind of concerning news is my friend who talked about ruining popcorn. She was really onto something. That people who have a lot of self-control want that information, they're willing to pay for it, and they do behave differently once they get it. People who don't have a lot of self-control by pretty good independent measures don't want the information and are not affected by it. So the upshot of this one excellent paper, though it's just one, is that calorie labels are going to help people who least need them, and they are going to have no impact except a negative emotional impact on those who most need them. Now, the good news is that on balance, the people who want calorie labels want them more than the people who don't want calorie labels don't want them. So to give you a little data, my 11 nation survey, which involved nationally representative samples and big ones, finds that for basically everything we tested, people are willing to pay more for information, even if they're a minority of the population, then in aggregate, people who don't want the information are willing to pay not to get it. So in general, information provision seems, by reference to the willingness to pay criterion, which is the economist gold standard, not mine. I have a lot of problems with it, but let's just say it's a way of measuring. It suggests information provision is a good idea. But in terms of figuring out exactly how good it is, we now have more clarity about how to approach that question because we have a framework with which to do that. And for government regulators to be thinking not, we have no idea, as they sometimes say, or we're just going to focus on the health benefits. That's important, but that's not the whole picture. If you have health benefits, but you make people miserable, then the health benefits are missing something. The suggestion is that we not only can do better in thinking about what are the effects of information disclosure, but we also should be able to do better in figuring out what disclosures are best, meaning which have the biggest impact, which are most likely to change behavior, which are least likely to trigger information avoidance. And if we can do that, maybe we can save a lot of lives. And if you're thinking about COVID-19 and vaccine hesitancy or mask wearing, so am I. Okay, that's about policy and government regulation. Now to talk just a little bit about health in general. This is going to be a little reckless, but let's sneak up on it by talking about behavioral law and economics first. The framework so far has suggested that people are rationally thinking about the instrumental value and the emotional impact of information. But we know from decades of work that that's not quite right. Human beings tend to suffer or benefit from present bias, which means today really matters, tomorrow probably, the next month, and certainly the next year might be a foreign country, later land, and we're not sure we're ever going to visit. With respect to information provision, present bias can screw us up. That is, present bias can lead us to avoid information that'll make us sad, but that could, if we got it, change our life for the better. We know that during an economic downturn, people are less likely to check their stock portfolios than when the economy is booming. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In the abstract, you shouldn't stop checking when the economy is crashing and be, attending carefully when the economy is doing really well. The reason seems to be that when the economy is doing well, people want to smile. And when it's doing badly, they don't want to scowl. And they know that the information will be joyful in one context and it will be depressing in another context. Okay, but it might be good to know what's happening to your portfolio during a tough time. And you can think of this with respect to any number of things. I noticed, maybe you've seen this too, that students who don't think they've done well in a class, sometimes they don't want to check their grade. They don't want to pick it up. Okay, good. Present bias can lead people to avoid information, even though on balance, it would be a really good idea for them to get it. And we know in the medical context that people who avoid negative health information are often much more resilient than they think. That is, they get information that's a blow, say they have some diabetes, but within a month or two, they're basically fine emotionally, they're resilient, and they adjust to it. Okay, we also know that people tend to be unrealistically optimistic on average, which can lead both to information avoidance, thinking, why do I need it? And to information acquisition, thinking it's going to turn out really well. And both of those can be distorting. What I think it's useful to focus on is present bias as a discouraging factor and optimistic bias as the same, which can lead people not to learn things about health and safety or money or the world that can be very good to learn. Those are distorting factors. Okay, on mental health, if you look at two conditions, depression and anxiety, they're associated with different impacts on information seeking. Depression is associated with information avoidance. Anxiety is often associated with information seeking. And these can be self-reinforcing things. So depression leading to information avoidance can make the depression worse. Anxiety leading to information seeking can lead to seeking information, which intensifies anxiety. And these are things that mental health professionals might want to be exploring in the context of treatment. Okay, now let's turn, shall we, to sludge. 11 billion hours, if you remember anything from these remarks, I hope it's 11 billion hours in paperwork burdens imposed on the American public. President Trump and candidate Biden disagree on many things. Did you know that? That's not too much information. You wouldn't pay for that information. You already have it. But with respect to that 11 billion hours, I'm pretty confident that both President Trump and Vice President Biden would think, what are we going to do about that? That's too high. Neither Democratic nor Republican administrations have had wars on sludge, though they have had skirmishes against sludge. And this is kind of a confession that in my time in government, while I took the problem seriously, I wish I had done more. Okay, the reason sludge is as problematic as it is first and foremost that people of all kinds often are drained by the fact that to get an occupational license or to get a permit or to get financial aid for education or to get a visa to come to the United States or England. And I've learned a lot about visa sludge from some people at Harvard, which has always been bad in the United States. It seems to be worse now for obvious reasons. But whatever your policy views, in some domains, visa sludge is just a cruelty. It's a cruelty not only because of the time, but also because of the deterrent effect on getting the relevant thing in the first instance. So I'm just going to give you one example. The Earned Income Tax Credit is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in the United States. The take-up rate is pretty good. Last I checked, it was in the vicinity of 80%. But that means 20% of poor Americans are not getting the Earned Income Tax Credit, which has positive effects not only on their economic situation, but on their health, the health of their children, and the long-term health and educational opportunities of their kids. That's a lot of Americans, that 20%. There's a little sludge, and we could easily reduce it or take it away. Okay, the reason sludge is as hard on people as it has been is not just, and now we're going to shift from standard economic thinking to behavioral law and economics, it's that human beings have limited bandwidth in their heads, and especially if you are poor, poorly educated, suffering from some illness, physical or mental, or elderly, sludge can be a devastation because inertia and present bias often interact with those characteristics of life, such as to lead the bandwidth to being a prohibition effectively. Now, sometimes government officials are alert to this and not particularly sad about it. They might use sludge as a screening device for federal resources, but often the adverse effects of sludge, particularly the adverse distributional effects, are not intended and are inadvertent and are just a problem of poor program design. Okay, what we need institution of all kinds to do, and Harvard Law School is one. It's not the worst offender by any means. In fact, it's not within a zillion miles of the worst, but any institution can benefit from this, is to have a sludge audit, which can be formal or informal, a mechanism by which to understand the volume of sludge that are being imposed on, let's say, patients or would-be permit holders or students or recipients of some program for people who need it. What is the level of sludge and is it justified? If that seems a little fanciful, actually the US government does one. It's supposed to every year. It's called the Information Collection Budget of the United States. It's not on the top of the New York Times bestseller list, but it's a sludge audit. And it has both an aggregate number and an agency by agency number. We know the Department of Treasury is the big sludge imposer, but the Department of Education imposes a lot of sludge. So does the Department of Energy. So does the Department of Transportation. And a sludge audit could be motivating for sludge reduction. If that sounds itself a little science fiction, the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a war on sludge, where with respect to health and money, there's been a mostly bottom-up effort by public officials in local, state, and national governments to take sludge away. To say, for example, you don't need an interview to get this, we know. Or to say, we're going to simplify the form. Or to say, it's going to be automatic. You're going to get the check in your bank account. You're not going to have to do anything extra. Or to reduce waiting time. So this has yet to be fully explored, but we've seen a simultaneous set of battles against sludge, which have had very good effects, and some increases in sludge, which have been designed to reduce the likelihood that people will travel from one place to another, or reduce the likelihood that people from an infected place will come in. So Americans, where they aren't banned from going to foreign countries, they often have a lot of sludge to navigate, and that might well have a public health justification. So we can think of sludge as being a good way to ensure program eligibility sometimes, and sometimes being a justifiable screening device. But the basic plea of the argument here is that the government is acquiring too much information from too many people to be justified given its legitimate goals. Okay, I promised to tell you something about social media, or I threatened to tell you something about social media, and I'm going to redeem that promise/threat. I'm just going to give you a little data, some data points. So I did a nationally representative survey of how much people are willing to pay to use social media platforms. Let's start with that. And I asked America, how much are you willing to pay to use Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc.? And I went one by one. And a lot of people said nothing. I'm willing to pay $0. And the median amount was typically low, 5 or 10. So the amount people are willing to pay to use social media is small. That's a puzzle. That really surprised me, especially the large number of 0 answers. Let me give 2 explanations, which maybe tell us something about the human mind and surveys and policy. Explanation number 1 is that some of the respondents think, I use social media, and the data applies to people who are users, not people who are non-users. I tested them separately, and the numbers surprisingly look pretty close on this dimension. People are saying, I use it, but I'm wasting my time. Let's call it a wasting time good, WTG. And for wasting time goods, people are willing to pay nothing. They do it, but if you ask how much would you shell out for it, they'll say 0. I think this category is of interest and it hasn't been explored, of things that people do that they don't really value doing, such that if you take it away from them and ask them how much would they pay for it, they'd say, I don't care, fine. Okay, the other explanation is that people value social media, but they're used to getting it for free. And when you ask them how much they're willing to pay, they get mad and they say nothing. Not because they don't value it, not because it's wasting time, but because it's a protest answer. And that has implications for kind of the morality of pricing, where something that's free suddenly gets a charge. There's going to be some rebellion, at least in the short run. Okay, that's the first experiment. The second experiment, stunned by my findings, I asked America basically, how much would you have to be paid to get off Facebook or YouTube for a month? How much would you have to be paid? And now the answers got significant. $50, $100, people demanded something real to get off Facebook or YouTube. What's going on there? Is that a better measure than the willingness to pay? Willingness to pay and willingness to accept are supposed to be the same. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize for basically assuming that they would. And here we get a disparity that's crazy high, often 10 to 1. Okay, what I found in the experiment is not what I expected, which is a replication of a behavioral economics finding, but on steroids. The finding is, suppose you all had a Harvard mug and someone, let's say the library, said, how much would I have to pay you to give me the Harvard mug? The amount you'd demand from the Harvard Library to give up your Harvard mug, I'm hoping you're going to like the Harvard mug sufficiently that you demand something, it will be typically double the amount that you'd be willing to pay to buy the Harvard mug in the first place. So we could, in principle, do this experiment online. I could say, everyone who's, half of you, you have my book, too much information. It's arriving in the mail within the next 15 minutes, but we'll buy it from you for a certain price. And the other half could be asked, how much would you be willing to pay for the book? Typically, the first group, how much would you demand to give up for good, would demand twice as much as the number that would be provided for willingness to pay. Okay, that's called the endowment effect. Works for lottery tickets, works for mugs, works for pens. But I got a crazy super endowment effect, 10 to 1, not 2 to 1. I don't fully understand it, but I think the willingness to pay figure is low for the reasons given, and the willingness to accept number is high for a similar reason. People are saying, you're trying to take me away from the way that I connect with people. I'm mad. You're going to have to pay me a lot. So it's in the nature of a protest answer. I'm speculating. Okay, last bit of data I'm going to give you on social media has a simple punchline, which is social media is providing too much information. People should probably scale down their use by about 10%. I'm making that up, but that's consistent with the data I'm about to tell you. Okay, so other experimenters found a similar set of numbers to what I found with respect to how much people would demand to give up use of Facebook for a month. People would demand $50, $100. And they took up the offer from people who demanded 100. They said, we'll give you 100. And then they measured how that month was for the people who were without Facebook for the month. On every measure of well-being, that month was better than a month in the control group, which stayed on Facebook and demanded $100. So the treatment group demanded 100, got off. The control group demanded 100, stayed on. The treatment group showed lower levels of depression, lower levels of anxiety, higher levels of happiness, and more satisfaction with their life. And then people were asked, after doing without Facebook for a month, they were asked, now how much would you demand to be off for another month? And the median answer was $87. It went down 13. Okay, I think that's profoundly interesting. It went down, so people learned, but it stayed pretty high, even though people had had a good month. I'll give you two explanations which map on to what we've been discussing throughout. Explanation one, which I think the researchers prefer, is that the Facebook users who got off didn't forget that they had slightly happier months, but they're willing to trade a little bit in how much they enjoy their days for more information. So they got less political information and they knew less about politics. They were less connected with their friends and families by definition. And they were willing to think, you know, smiling a lot isn't everything. I'd rather know about my country and know what's happening in my community than be a little less anxious. That's a good trade. So the $87 is picking up on the instrumental value of the information, even if it isn't increasing the hedonic value of life. There we go. The alternative explanation, which I confess I prefer for reasons that I can't identify through introspection, I find it more fun, is that the people who are demanding $87 are making a mistake, that they are in the grip of a habit or a mild addiction, maybe it's more than mild, and they are missing the fact that if they were off it for a month or if they reduced, they'd be a bit better off. And their demand for a significant amount of money to be off is inconsistent with the fact, which they don't quite get, which is that they'd be better off with at least less, something like that. But we don't know the answer. Okay, I have a plea and then a little literature for you, and then we're going to end at least my remarks. The plea is what unifies these comments about social media, sludge, and too much information as a recipe for policy with respect to the side effects of medication, the consequences of buying a mortgage, all those pages and pages of things, and that confusing, really fast verbiage you hear in a TV ad when they say this thing's going to help you if you have disease X, but, and then really rapid fire, there are 7 things that are bad side effects that might happen. The plea is to think in all of these contexts about what's the most precious thing that human beings are privileged to have. And this connects in my own mind with the story I told you about my dad, and also connects, I hope, in all of our minds with the situation which the world faces today with the pandemic. What is the most precious thing people have that we're blessed to have? Time. Let's find a way to give people more of it. And my closing remarks are not from me. They are from 2 works of literature. The first is Thomas Gray's Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College. And the last lines you're probably going to know. But this poem, which has kind of cliche last lines, it's, I think, almost unbearably moving. It's a poem about an author of unclear age, not young, writing about people like most of you, I think, in their 20s or younger, who have joy and openness and promise and a sense of, even under tough conditions, of the wonder and amazingness of life. And what the poet is saying is things are going to get tough. And then he writes, yet, why should they know their fate? Since sorrow never comes too late and happiness too swiftly flies, thought would destroy their paradise. No more. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. My other passage takes a different take on the human condition, and see this as a signal of what was almost the title of the book, which was Knowledge is Power, but Ignorance is Bliss. You've just heard Ignorance is Bliss. Here's a passage, very brief, from a novel called Possession, the greatest English language novel ever, Don't Argue. And A.S. Byatt in Possession is quoting a letter, authoring a letter that, that the hero of the book writes to his lover-to-be. And it seems to be about something about reading, but it's really much broader. It's about life. And this is really about their relationship and about human inclination to know. And the poet, Randolph Ashe, writes to his lover-to-be, I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending, sweet or sour, and to be done with what I need never have embarked on. Are you in my case, or are you a more discriminating reader? Do you lay aside the unprofitable? Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Sunstein. We have our first audience question for you. The question is, I wonder to what extent you found OIRA processes and CBA ever to be unjustified sludge for government agencies themselves that might prevent them from taking beneficial action that they may have otherwise taken. In other words, has OIRA done a sludge audit for what it imposes on agencies? And if so, what did it find?
Okay, it's a great question. So when I was at OIRA, we were constantly thinking, is our process imposing decisional burdens that justify themselves? So maybe I should say a little bit for people what OIRA's process involves. Suppose the Department of Education wants to issue a regulation involving for-profit schools. Maybe trying to protect students against exploitation or something. The rule will be submitted to OIRA, then OIRA will submit it to the National Economic Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, the Domestic Policy Council, multiple other agencies, which will make comments on the rule. And then there'll be a deliberative process in which people decide what the rule's best form will take. And most of the deliberation in many of the cases, and certainly the most important cases, doesn't involve OIRA itself. It involves other parts of the government weighing in and trying to make the best rule. There are cases where the urgency of the problem is such that the process I just described needs to be sped up. And so you can see it, it's all public, how long rules are under review at OIRA. And sometimes it's a short process, a month or less. And considering that a rule is often a multi-year thing, a month isn't a lot of sludge. Sometimes it's many, many months. And I worked really hard at OIRA to get rules out in the face of interagency disagreement, where the rules were very important. But if there's interagency disagreement, and let's say a cabinet head says this is a nonsense and it's going to create terrible problems, to work out the disagreement might be quite challenging. And OIRA, to override a cabinet head who has strong objections to a rule, you wouldn't do that lightly, and that might take the delay. So it's hard to quantify the costs and benefits of the process just described, but a kind of informal sludge audit about how things are going basically every week is something I certainly did.
Great, thank you. Our next question from the audience. Regarding sludge reduction, how do you think through the value of just reducing the number of hours of sludge versus focusing on making sludge less intolerable? For example, more predictable, more user-friendly, more feeling of control. If you could speak more about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So first cut would be hours, but you're completely right that, so you're raising an original point that there's hardly any literature on. The work I know, there's a recent paper, I think unpublished, that tries to measure the value of time. And it finds, not surprisingly, that the value of time differs depending on what people are doing. If they are doing something they hate, that's a very valuable, costly hour. If people are doing something that's kind of fun, like a game. So I haven't thought about this except in connection with this new paper, but you're completely right that to reduce the hours is a kind of easy-ish thing, but to make the hours, if they're going to stay constant, not pulling out whatever hair you have hours, that would be a good thing.
Professor Sunstein, it looks like, oh, we might have one more question. Let's see. Let's take this one last question.
Should we
This
use
is a good one.
behavioral tricks? So if you ask a question, there's some chance you will get a Harvard mug. Or if you don't like it, some chance, I can't say it's more than 0.00001, but some chance. And if you don't want a Harvard mug, there's some chance you'll get something comparable in value that you really want, but only if you ask a question.
Right? And asking questions is so important. So I think this is a great last question. If you were in your first year of law school right now, but you somehow knew most of the stuff that you know, which area of law would you choose to focus on? Would you follow the path you've taken so far, or would you change your path?
Well, I kind of love administrative law. My dog just entered the room, and he's here to remind me that I love him more than I love administrative law. But I think I would follow the path I took just because I really enjoy what I work on. But I can't rule out the possibility that if I'd taken some other path, tax would be surprising. I never especially love that. Sorry to those of you who do. But there are plenty of areas that are interesting, really interesting. And they kind of make you into a different person a little bit. So it's hard to think, make yourself that person and think which would be happier or more interested. Probably be interested in what you ended up interested in. But following administrative law, constitutional law, and then behavioral law and economics, let's call it, those have all been joys to me. So I wouldn't miss them.
You never know where your path comes from, and sometimes sticking with it and sort of learning from everything that influences you is a great path to take, right? So in retrospect, you've sort of let go of ignorance, which can be blissful, and continue to strive and learn. And I think that's one of the great examples you set for our students, Professor Sunstein. We're so delighted to have had you with us. And we'll look forward to talking with you about your next book.
Thank you. Thanks
so much. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for being here. The 55 of you are here. Hope to meet you in person someday and online someday soon.
Yes, see you soon. Take care. Thank you, everyone.